Hello, hello.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
What? I can, yes. What's up, Dylan? Have you done many Twitter Spaces?
I've done only one before, and I'm still shocked that you can only use them or be a speaker on them in mobile.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, cool. We're happy to have you for your second space. So it'll be fun.
Yeah. Some of the others on the Marko team are also, in theory, going to be joining. We'll see if they um, chime in. They're just
Awesome. Well,
installing. They're just installing the Twitter app because normally they would use the web app. But anyways.
totally. Well, point them out if they hop into the crowd, and I'll add them as a speaker. What's up, Scott?
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to JavaScript Jam Live. Oh, man. It's going to
Oh,
be a good
yeah.
one. It's going to be a good one
That's
today,
great.
folks. Oh, yes. Marko is what we're talking about today with our dear friend Dylan. And
Hello.
hello. Super excited. Anthony's face today is JavaScript Jam. So if you don't know who Anthony is and you're listening to this, just search on the Twitter spaces, the Twitters for Anthony Campello, AJC Web Dev, at AJC Web Dev. You'll find him there. Be sure to follow him and, JavaScript Jam wouldn't mind to follow as well. But let's give you some value first today. Let's have some fun together. Like I said, we're going to be talking about Marko, as you can see from the title, with Dylan here. But I just want to say this real quick. Whether you're a beginner or whether you've been doing this for a very long time, web developing, that is, it doesn't matter. We want to hear from everybody, right? So feel free to request to come up, and you can ask questions, state facts, opinions, whatever. We love to hear everything. In fact, actually, when someone comes up, that's when we get the most value from the sessions together, because people are engaged and having fun. It creates some great conversations. So feel free to request come up, and love to have you contribute, be a part of this amazing group that we have every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And real quick here, just want to note that coming up in the near future, we are going to be going to some events. JavaScript Jam will be there. Anthony and I will be there. And one of those events is React Miami. Don't know if you're going, but it's going to be a good time. I think there's a lot of great speakers there. And we will be there live together. So looking forward to that. We have more things coming up in the future weeks to talk about with that as well. But enough of that. Let's talk about today with Marko with Dylan, Marko and Dylan together.
Dylan is Marko.
Yes, I love it.
Pretty dang close.
Pretty much. All right. By the way, real quick, I'll introduce myself, and then Anthony can introduce himself, and then Dylan, you can introduce yourself. But my name is Scott Steinlug, and I'm the technical community manager at Edgio. Anthony.
Hello. My name is Anthony Campolo. I am a developer advocate at Edgio, and I am super excited for this episode. I'm a big fan of Marko. I see Michael in the audience. I think someone else will probably be pulling up here. But Dylan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little bit about your background and what Marko is.
Yeah, for sure. Hello, my name's Dylan. I actually discovered Marko while I was working at an agency that essentially hammered out websites. So this was 5 years ago now, or actually a bit more. And so I was hammering out websites, and there's various different requirements that came up, and ultimately, it kind of had me thinking about like what does or what should the web look like? What are its strengths and all that stuff, and how can I build performant websites ultimately? And so I built some tools around that, and ultimately discovered Marko, which is like super different from a lot of the other technologies at the time, and it was invented actually by Patrick Steele at eBay. way back in 2012. And so it kind of was aligning with some of the things that I was coming to believe are like the essentials of the web. And so I looked at integrating it with my tools, and ultimately one thing led to another, and I ended up joining eBay. So I've been at eBay for the past 5 years, and Marko came out of basically a need that eBay had to maintain developer productivity and maintain the site performance at the same time. So I could go into a little bit more about Marko's history, which I think is really interesting, just because it is such an old framework, but has been like continually evolving. And I think like if you've never heard of it, it's got a lot of things that you would kind of be surprised about considering when it was built. I've also got Michael Rawlings here in the chat, who's a part of the Marko core team, and we've got Ryan Turnquist and Luke as well, who have Ryan and Luke have actually joined us in the past year. How long has it been? I'm actually not 100% sure. But anyway, so they've been doing great work on Marko as well, so they'll probably chime in at some point. Maybe they should introduce themselves real quick as well.
Yeah, I sent speaker invites to all three of them.
They might not have downloaded the Twitter app, so we'll see. Maybe they can't speak. Okay, we've got Luke. Hey, Luke.
Hi. I guess I could do introduction as well if
go
you'd
ahead
like.
and introduce yourself.
Yeah. I'm actually a pretty recent college graduate. I kind of came straight to eBay through Marko out of college, and I think I got really lucky because now I'm sort of obsessed with the developer experience that comes with front end, and I think Marko is a pretty great solution for that. I'm sure we'll go into that more later.
A very sweet place to be right out of college. You're getting a very thorough web education.
Yes. It's definitely some fun stuff. I mean, I've been working on Marko for 5 years now, and it's like there's constantly new and exciting things to be looking into beyond what we're even working on right now. Like we have a vision way out into the future of what we think we can accomplish with it. And it's got a fairly to just because Marko is a language, Marko is a compiler, Marko is a bundler in some ways. Like it's a whole bunch of things. It's really trying to take on like the whole like server to front end asset orchestration pipeline and rendering and all of that. So there's like a whole bunch of different pieces to it, and pretty much every one of those pieces can be optimized in some way. So yeah, there's lots and lots of exciting stuff there. Oh, we've got Ryan here now as well.
Hey, I'm Ryan Turnquist. Yeah, I just joined eBay in, I guess it was August, working on Marko. I'm a member of the Solid JS core team as well, where I was mostly working on the router. So that's kind of my background.
Yeah, and Ryan's actually been working on a thing that we released just recently, which is Marko Run, which is like our meta framework built on top of Marko, which is actually kind of funny. I mean, we had a meta framework before, but it was like somewhat limited. And the reality is like a lot of different, because of the way Marko is set up, you don't really need a meta framework to work with it. And since it's like super performance focused as well, a lot of times people just want to have their bespoke setup that's tuned exactly the way that they want. And so they're not necessarily these meta framework tools. But anyways, we wanted to build a meta framework that actually met all of the needs that eBay had in terms of like performance, and also just have this modern DX and all that stuff. So Ryan's been doing a really good job on that specific piece. Yeah, and we've got Michael here as well. If he's not able to be a speaker, I'll just, maybe he'll, I don't know, there's no chat in this, right? Like it's just
so you can tweet to the space. I actually just did so, and then you can pin things on the Jumbotron. So right now we got the Marko Run up top.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so Michael has also been a part of the Marko team for, I think, 6 years now. So he's done a lot of great stuff for Marko too. Yeah, so should I just like dive right in and give people a little bit about like what and why Marko? Obviously, I've talked a little bit about it.
Yeah, go as deep as you want. We got plenty of time.
Cool. So yeah, basically, if you've never heard of Marko, probably the first thing you're wondering is like, why does this thing exist? And then you're also probably thinking, like I already said, it's, it was created in 2012. So like, what was the environment like there? How did it get to that point where it seemed like a framework needed to be developed? And there was a whole bunch of frameworks being developed at the time. So I want to dispel a little bit that it's just another framework that was tackling the exact same problems as React or Angular or Vue or anything else that was coming out around the same time. So it actually kind of starts obviously with eBay's history, because it was a framework that was designed to meet eBay's needs. But the specific thing with eBay is, it's been around since 1995, right? And obviously at that time, the experience was not built with any JavaScript in mind. And also, as an experience, it was something that scaled or needed to scale a lot, right? Like it got a huge user base right away. It kind of blew up into popularity. And so essentially the very first version of eBay called Auction Web at the time was built with Perl, and pretty much, within a couple of years, they realized that it just wasn't going to scale. And so they actually switched the entire backend rendering experience to be C++ so that could be faster. And still we're talking like hardly any JavaScript at that point. So these are just experiences that are, we're sending HTML to the browser, and the whole experience is driven through like link clicks, navigation, form submissions, and like that kind of thing. So it's pretty lightweight. And obviously back then it had to be in the 90s, or the users would just never be able to load the page, because I'm pretty sure you couldn't load modern pages in back in the dial-up days. Anyways, so eventually the C++ code base ended up being pretty hard to maintain, and so they switched to Java, which was like a happy medium, but it was still very much server rendered, and a focus on performance and all that sort of stuff. But in 2012, there was a serious concern about what the developer experience was like, where you're essentially, at this point, there's JavaScript in the browser for sure, but just for the interactive pieces. And so you'll bring in, jQuery to enhance some portion of the experience. And then you've got the Java application doing the bulk of the rendering on the server. And this ends up being, relatively fast, even bringing in jQuery. But the reason it's fast is because, one, Java's rendering is fast. Two, you can leverage streaming and techniques like that. But also because since you're only sending the interactive pieces of JavaScript to the browser, you essentially don't have this modern problem where in a SPA, you end up sending the entire app to the browser. So the JavaScript scaled a lot better than many modern SPA-like setups. And so basically what happened was eBay was, looking at things, like Node.js looks cool, single language across the stack, makes sense for rendering where you're going to be doing, all of your template code. You don't want to duplicate that with the browser. So this is like a clear DX issue. But at the same time, it's like, we can't compromise on performance. Like every millisecond matters, and there's constant performance monitoring on all the pages and so on. And then the other thing is that eBay as an experience is actually a multi-page app where any of the pages that you go to can actually be an entirely separate application, right? Maintained by an entirely separate team that's probably using like a similar tech stack, but not necessarily. Some of the pages could be implemented even in a different language. It was very like limited restrictions on what you can do. You can do pretty much anything. But the main thing that you had to do is make sure that your experience was fast and you could deliver it quickly. So with all that in mind, essentially, Patrick Steele-Idem in 2012 was looking into, okay, how can we make a JavaScript framework that has really fast server-side rendering, because that is like we were competing with the Java rendering, and how can we make it so that while maintaining a good like modern DX, we only send the necessary parts of JavaScript to the browser. And so those are the like key fundamentals of Marko. It's performance and developer experience, right? And so, like I said, Marko is a language, and that language is designed to be able to be easy to write. Like in terms of good DX, it's actually like starts as HTML, but extends HTML in a way that allows you to represent pretty much anything in a very terse format if you want. But then also Marko takes that language and compiles it to completely different things depending on the environment we're deploying to. So like on the server side, and this is way back, in 2012, we're compiling the templates to be raw string on the server, like no VDOM overhead or any weirdness like that. And there was actually like a benchmark way back then as well that was showing Marko as like, hundreds of times faster than some of the other solutions. And, at that time, there was also like the recommendation from Angular and stuff like that to do like this pre-rendering, which is like spinning up a whole browser. And, that would be even more ridiculously slow than something like a VDOM. So anyways, Marko optimized for, string concatenation on the server, and then eventually landed on a VDOM implementation in the browser, although it was like loosely VDOM. But like 2 different compilation targets was like a necessary thing from the beginning. So Marko was a compiler from the beginning, which meant it can do some of the fun things that you might think of, like when you think of Svelte. Like obviously it can do tricks that don't really make sense from something as simple of a language as JSX. So Marko kind of always had that. And then Marko also always had this feature of like streaming templates, because it's critical when you have an experience that's consuming so many different data sources, and these data sources have varying amounts of latency. You don't want your application to be as slow as the lowest common denominator. Obviously, React has semi-recently come out with streaming support, and other frameworks are picking that up as well, but that was like a key thing in Marko as well. And then the other key thing is the opt-in to which components get sent to the browser. You can think, if you're familiar with Astro or even React server components to a degree, you have to essentially say, these are the components that get sent to the browser, right? And in Marko, we wanted to make it so that like that wasn't something you really had to think about. So in Marko, actually what happens is the same process under the hood is going on, where it figures out, what server components, what's browser components, how do we only send necessary code to the browser, but we do it automatically. That's kind of been our ethos. Like, how can we make it so that it feels like you're writing, a quote unquote modern style framework without having to like make these concessions to the developer experience to achieve performance. So that's really been our goal, and that's essentially where Marko is at today. You can think of it as a competitor to like Astro and Quick to a degree, but there's a whole bunch more stuff and things that we've been working on to go well beyond this whole like what we call partial hydration and progressive rendering and these sorts of things. So maybe we'll talk a bit about that. Do you have any questions or anything from anyone in the audience? Or
yes, that's all good stuff. We have Michael up here now, so we should have him introduce himself, and then we can dive back into the framework.
Yeah, I'll just be quick. Yeah, I'm Michael Rawlings. I've been working on Marko for, I guess, like 7 years now, 6 or 7 years. And yeah, I ended up at eBay working on Marko. Just found it as I was working on some projects of my own, and started contributing back to the framework, and then ended up working for eBay. So that's kind of my origin story. I've been around the framework for a while now.
Awesome. I guess I would be curious, my first question would be, do you know, and this may be history that kind of predates you, if eBay kind of considered other frameworks before deciding to build their own?
Yeah, Michael can speak to it probably better.
Well, yeah, so around 2012, there was actually an initiative that was called the Polyglot Initiative. And so it wasn't just Node that was being looked at. There was some Scala code being written, and basically the engineering leadership kind of gave free rein to and encouraged people to just try out new technologies to see what the future of eBay should look like. And so what ended up winning that and kind of coming out on top was Node. And originally Dust.js was kind of the only existing framework that met eBay's needs to some degree from a performance perspective. And primarily that was because it's like the only templating language for Node prior to like 2020 besides Marko that supports streaming.
That's fine. I never even heard of Dust.js.
Yeah, the original author kind of disappeared, and
Yeah, the
LinkedIn and
domain's
eBay
dead.
sort of took over maintaining the project for a little bit, but both of them ended up moving on to Dust as well. So it's just kind of
one up in Dust or something.
Yeah,
Sorry,
Dust. It's just a templating language, though, not a framework so much. It's more like if you're familiar with like Pug or what was Jade or like EJS or like those kinds of things. It's basically just a simple server-side templating language that allowed you to do streaming, which was something that eBay realized pretty early that was going to be a requirement to use Node.
What's up, Dan? Slowly turning this into a solid team stream.
Hey,
I've
been a fan of Marko from afar. I like how it makes me feel like a space alien.
A space alien. Yes.
Like the templating syntax, it's very unique.
Yes,
it's
true. Yeah. Why don't we talk about that actually? So like what is there's like a Marko language, right?
Yes. And I think it's honestly it's probably my favorite thing about the whole project is this language. And it's very opinionated, and it's also something that I think takes developers off guard when they first see it, obviously, like space alien. But the really interesting thing about it is I feel like there's been essentially zero competition in the component-based declarative like UI framework authoring experience. Like, what does it look like to, in a nice way, author these declarative things without having to put a whole bunch of imperative glue in between? And so, we've been trying to look at what that means. And also, like a big reason for us to do that is kind of twofold. One, we want to make sure that everything you can do in the language is composable. Like you can, take our primitive language syntaxes and build complex things on top of them. But then we also want to make sure that everything is super optimizable. And so like we want to be able to differentiate between, this is JavaScript where something crazy can happen in between. And this is Marko code where we have known constraints. And so we can optimize and, do dead code elimination and that sort of thing. Yeah, so Marko, like as a language, like what does it kind of look like? It is, you start with HTML, right? So you start with HTML. You can, in most cases, take valid HTML code, put it in a Marko document, and it just kind of works. But Marko actually extends HTML instead of just acting or like adding syntax to generate HTML. So like if you think of JSX or something like that, it gives you escape hatches where you can interpolate in expressions that return more JSX. And so all of the like building up of the conceptual HTML happens in JavaScript, kind of in this like imperative world, unless you're looking at something like Solid, which takes a little bit more control over that. And so in Solid, you have, the control flow components, but Marko's had control flow components like from the beginning because we're trying to understand that entire picture. And we don't think control flow components are the only place where this kind of like having it baked into the language can help us out. And actually, real quick, since we have the Solid team here, I think this is kind of an interesting one because I know we were seeing some Twitter threads about Solid and the show tag not narrowing the conditions, right? So in Marko, everything is like the show tag kind of. But there's a primitive for like render bodies.
Explain what these components are and kind of for people who've never used these things before.
Right. So basically, Marko has built-in tags for control flow, which is like if statements and looping logic.
And that's similar to Svelte also has this.
Yeah, but so in Svelte, they essentially tack on a language to HTML, right? Like you've got the double, or you've got the curlies, and then you've got the hashtag if, right? Like it's a templating language on top of HTML, right? In Marko, it's actually, there is a tag that is called if, and you can pass it a condition, and it conditionally renders its body. right? But it's all a part of the Marko syntax. And you can actually go and build your own if tag that does, some slightly different behavior. Maybe you wanted to have an if tag that was animated, right? You could build a tag in userland with the exact same syntax as our core if tag and have it be animated. The same applies to our for loops. That syntax, like, you can use the exact same syntax, create your animated for tag, and all the end user of your component has to do is swap out their for tags with your animated for tags. Maybe it's a paginated for tag or whatever, but all of this stuff can be composed into different things that still leverage the same Marko language, which makes refactoring a lot easier, which is actually one of my pain points with JSX, in that, like, if you want to have a simple if statement, for example, in your template, like a simple conditional section that's rendered, you might throw in a conditional expression, or the ampersand whatever. Like, you're just going to do a check and it's all going to be in the JavaScript. But now say you take that same requirement of conditionally showing something and add the animation requirement that I mentioned. Well, now you have to operate in components. So you actually have to go, and the person that wants to adopt that has to go in and change their code away from JavaScript syntax into the template syntax in order to abstract away that sort of behavior, if that makes sense. And Solid has the same composition model, at least in terms of the control flow. Does that answer the question of like what these control flows
Yeah, that's
are?
good. Yeah. So what was your question for the Solid team?
Yeah, so this is more of just like a little tiny friendly jab. But so one of the benefits of having this be a language, and Marko's semantics being that the body content doesn't evaluate until after the child says that it wants it, is we can know that it's impossible for like stuff to change out from underneath you. So in TypeScript, in Solid, if you're using a show tag and you narrow something, so you're like, show this when the user is defined or something like that. Well, inside the body, because Solid uses render props, or not render props, I guess it's like a function body thing, which is essentially render props, TypeScript will not know if that user object has changed by the time that function runs. There's no way that TypeScript could have that guarantee, right? But in the Marko language, we do have that guarantee. And so with the Marko TypeScript support that we just put out, like, that narrowing actually does just work. And it doesn't matter, what kind of narrowing you're doing. It's just like Marko knows that the language works in a way that that narrowing is valid. And so we essentially tell TypeScript, hey, that's valid. You can output that. And so there's a few things like this. Another one is, well, like tag references. So, like use ref and stuff like that. Marko has an explicit syntax for that as well. And that syntax actually allows for hoisting. And that's actually pretty powerful, because often when you have something like a reference, you want to get a reference to some element and then use it somewhere else, right? And so what you would do in React or Solid or whatever is essentially put a let tag, or sorry, not a let tag, a let statement at the beginning of your component function. And that would say like, okay, I've got this ref. And then you have to type what that ref is going to be, even though it's only used in one place. Like in a perfect world, TypeScript could infer what the type of that ref is. But because Marko, has a special syntax for that and allows hoisting all that stuff, you can basically get a ref to a div or, any element or whatever. And Marko's going to know exactly what type that is, and you're going to get the right type IntelliSense for it as well, which is pretty nice. So there's a few places in the language where, because we're able to represent things in a way that is within our language that we have control over, that we can actually make the completions better, we can make the compiled output better. And in this case, we can even make the DX better. It's more composable. You don't have to like say, okay, I've got essentially this code for the ref is in two places. It's in the top of my function and it's down in my template logic as well. Instead, you could have it in one place where you probably wanted it, right? So it makes refactoring easier. And there's a whole bunch of things that we're thinking about like that go into the language design. And so one thing to point out is like when you first see Marko's syntax, again, think of it as HTML as if HTML and JavaScript were built together at the same time, and with the goal being of building components. And so what we've done is essentially added additional features to HTML. And that might sound limiting at first, but actually we've added pretty much every feature you could possibly need. And it's been battle tested as well at this point. So one of the things that's actually quite nice is any attribute value is just a JavaScript expression. Like that's what you're passing at the end of the day to these tags as JavaScript expressions. Why can't the attributes that you pass just be JavaScript expressions? And so like you don't have to wrap everything in curlies or anything like that. We're worrying about like weird escapes for single quotes or anything strange. It just kind of works. The attributes in Marko templates are JavaScript expressions, which is actually quite nice. And then there's also like shorthands for methods. It just follows the JavaScript shorthand method syntax. There's also, like I mentioned, ways for tags to provide variables, which is very similar to hooks, ways for tags to inject variables into the body, which is similar to render props. But like these things are a core part of the language because we know you need them and we know we can optimize them better and provide better DX around those types of patterns. So yeah, and it's also designed to be like a very incremental thing as well, especially if you're coming from HTML. It's a little bit trickier if you're coming from JSX, wondering what's going on. But
yeah, this is good actually because Dev had a question and I wanted to ask some of the newer members of the Marko team, what's it been like getting kind of spun up with Marko, and has it been challenging or has it made sense coming from your other JavaScript experience, or like what's the learning curve been like?
I think the learning curve for Marko is actually really shallow, especially right now we're on everything coming out is Marko 5. Marko 5 is pretty similar to Svelte, I would say, kind of, because you have separate classes. But Marko 6, I think, is going to be huge because the developer experience is much smaller learning curve, I think, if you already know HTML and JavaScript. And then knowledge of React will also be really helpful. As someone who came in as a React developer and a vanilla JavaScript developer, it was less than a week before I feel like I knew most of the features of Marko. So I think it was pretty easy to come in.
yeah, and a lot of the power features, like similar to React hooks, like you might not necessarily understand, how a hook is implemented, but you know how to go and consume a hook. That API is pretty easy. And it's kind of the same is true with Marko's tag variable syntax. Like basically a tag can do anything in Marko. It can give you variables, it can provide variables to its body, it can render content, like all of these things. But it can all be abstracted. So it's very easy, especially for new developers who are more likely to consume these complex components, to just throw them into their template and it just kind of makes sense, right? They don't have to worry about things like hook rules or anything like that could trip them up, which in my view is like an abstraction leak. But the other thing is like, what I guess specifically talking about hooks is, hooks cannot render DOM. And I think that is a pretty strange limitation, but I mean, I get obviously why React did it. But in Marko's case, it like everything is a tag. It can render DOM or it cannot render DOM, which means you can create hooks that compose different types of behavior. Like you can create a tag that tells you, without having to pass around refs or doing anything weird, if a current section of the DOM is in the viewport. Like things like that. Things that are actually context, like DOM position aware, you can do with Marko's equivalent of hooks. So there's just superpowers like that come out as well that make it easier.
That's not to say that those kind of things can't be represented by hooks, because a hook in React could return like a JSX element that then you place in your JSX tree at a specific location. So like I don't know that there's anything that like can't be represented by other frameworks, but I do think that a lot of these cases, it's just less code and I think easier to understand with the syntax that we have with Marko.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Like all of this stuff, like, you can build all of this with vanilla.js as well. Like, right? It's more talking about the developer experience part of it. Like, sure, you could have that hook that gives you a reference to something that you can put in the DOM, but wouldn't it be nicer if you just didn't have to do that at all or think about it at all? And that is the case with Marko's tags API. And yeah, so there's just a lot of things like that where, you're not having to duplicate where things are defined in multiple places, or like whenever you're refactoring, one of the key things React hooks, when they announced that, they highlighted was you want to make sure that you're touching as few places as possible. And since in Marko, everything can be like co-located right next to the implementation or the usage of the tag, it's very easy to do that kind of co-location. There's no arbitrary rule that says, okay, hooks have to go up here and they potentially have to be in this order and they can't be, rendered conditionally, and like all that sort of stuff doesn't matter. You can put a hook anywhere in your Marko template, inside a div, like it doesn't matter. Inside an if statement, all that stuff is perfectly valid. So it's like, yeah, obviously, the React solution for how do you conditionally render a hook? Well, you have to basically refactor your code and split it out into another component. In Marko, you just put another piece of state at that location. Like it's a one-line change versus premature refactoring. And so those are the kinds of places where you really see a win with the Marko language.
Yeah, I'll chime in and say I saw a tweet from Dan. I don't know if it was Dan Abramov earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, about like the beauty in something that's able to create a temporary mess. And he was specifically talking about React and Tailwind. But I think there's an aspect of that to Marko's language, in that like you could write an entire application in a single Marko file. There's never a point where you're forced to like split things out into components so that you can, either for performance reasons to like control what updates, or because of hook rules or anything like that. Like you can represent your entire application in a single Marko file. Now, should you know that would be a mess, but I think there is something nice to being able to like hack in a single file and then split things out according to your mental model of the application and not be constrained. And
maybe
this is
my
something
mental
like,
model needs to be in a single file.
yeah, and like,
yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's
joke.
always like, well, I mean, it could be, because it's like, why do you have to go into thinking about how I'm going to refactor things into multiple components when you don't even yet know how your application is going to be broken into components, or what duplication exists in your application and stuff like that? So usually when I look at refactoring and in terms of evaluating how good the refactoring experience is in the Marko language, it's, am I duplicating stuff? Okay, well then, that should be refactored so that the duplication doesn't happen. Or is the file just getting unusably large, right? Like, is it just too much? Is there too much cognitive load in this file? So that's another valid reason to split out. But those are like the two main valid reasons. If you're doing something and it's a small component and your framework forces you to extract it out into another component, or forces you to move around a whole bunch of code to be able to do your next step, that's where I feel like, the framework is really letting you down with refactoring. So
yeah, Ryan coming up here to achieve solid Marko parity, also former Marko teammate. I think he gave us
he still has Marko in his Twitter bio.
we still consider him core team.
Nice. Yeah, his connecting thing is spinning and spinning and spinning. We had another question from the audience about state, and this is probably good that Ryan's coming up as well. They said, after briefly looking at how to create state in Marko, it seems like it's very similar to React. Not sure about that. In essence, components re-render when you change state. Seeing the collab between Solid and Marko, is their plan to make DOM updates more fine-grained? I would also add on to that, when signals.
Yeah. So Marko 5 is VDOM driven. We do have a preview of the APIs that are coming to Marko 6 in a tags API preview package that you can install, and it basically gives you access to all these like let tag, const tag, and a lot of these that Dylan has mentioned. And in some ways, that's kind of like a stepping stone to where we're going. And it also looks, I think, in many ways like what React is doing with React Forget, because it puts like fine-grained execution almost on top of the VDOM model. But with Marko 6, we are dropping the VDOM and going fully to, they're not signals. they conceptually are, and they're using a propagation mechanism that in some ways is similar to what MobX has. But it's almost more so just like functions calling other functions, in a sense. The Marko compiler compiles to these like signal functions that basically ensure that things run in the right order, so that you don't see any like glitches or anything as data propagates throughout the tree. But it is fine grained, and it is basically like when you update a value, it calls a function which passes like any computations to like the next thing down the line and ultimately directly updates a DOM node. So like that is coming soon.
Yeah, it's actually, this is one of those things where it's like almost better to be able to show the code, because this signal-like implementation is very different than anything I've ever seen in any other framework, because it's entirely compiled. So basically the Marko compiler goes and looks at your code, figures out the dependency graph of the code in terms of like expression execution, and outputs a whole bunch of functions that are all at the root level, like basically detangles your code so that we can call these functions in the correct order that follows, the way you would typically think of signals. But one of the big reasons this is important to us, one, it's, pretty fast, but the big thing is that since we've like essentially untangled your code, so that it actually is like if you have a text node that gets changed by some, props to the component changing, there's a fine line, like individual functions that get called in between, and all of those functions are hoisted. The key there, since they're hoisted and detangled, we can actually dead code eliminate all the ones that can never change. And so this is what one of the big things that differentiates Marko 6 from Quick is that essentially there is no concept of, okay, this template is going to re-render, so we got to download that whole template. Obviously, Quick breaks things down at the template level, so it's not like you download one template, you don't need all of them, but it still does download the entire individual template that's re-rendering. In Marko 6, that's not the case at all, because Marko goes in with the compiler and detangles your entire template into a whole bunch of independent little functions that can be called in the same order that they would have been executed if it was like a signals runtime. So it's a really key part of our hydration and bundling strategy as well. So instead of it being like it is now, where it's partial hydration, sort of automatic islands architecture, it's more that if you have some code that directly goes and updates, or some state changes, and that causes 3 expressions to run, that ultimately changes like 2 DOM nodes, Marko 6 only bundles functions that basically do those things and not the rest of your template. And so it's pretty huge in terms of the savings you can get from that. And it means if you've got large static portions of your app, they're much more easily able to stay server only, versus the islands architecture where you add state or a component at some arbitrary height, and now like the majority of your application is sent to the browser. So
I really quickly want to say that Ryan has come in and out of the room like 4 times and tried to come up on stage like at least 3 times, and I don't know what the problem is.
Yeah, for some reason it keeps saying connecting, and it's not connecting. I told him to just join as a listener, and then I'll send him an invite. But he's having some trouble with spaces.
Yeah, I was having trouble initially because I just downloaded the app and then was having like permission issues because I hadn't granted the app permission to access.
I mean, he's been on a space with us before.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know then.
Anyway, continue on with the conversation. You had something else, Dylan?
Yeah, so just going into that a little bit, like I think comparing Marko 6 to Quick is one of the more interesting comparisons, just because Quick is doing a lot of awesome stuff in terms of resumability and the code splitting and all that sort of stuff. So I mentioned sort of what Marko 6's code splitting model is in terms of breaking up every one of your templates into a bunch of different functions automatically. Like you don't have to go in and add $signs anywhere or anything like that. Marko just knows where all these expressions are. But the other thing that's actually I think quite nice is Marko 6 also knows which expressions are needed in the browser. And it's actually resumable just as quick is. And so essentially what happens in Marko 6 is if you have some expression that you calculate during the rendering, and then you have some effect or an event handler or something that needs to be in the browser that is going to read that expression, the Marko 6 compiler knows about that and serializes just those pieces to be sent to the browser. Whereas if you look at something like Astro or Quick, typically the way that the serialization is going to work, and there are optimizations they can do, and they do, is they'll look at it from a component level. They'll be like, this component could re-render, and so we'll need to serialize its input, right? And so Marko 6 actually takes it to the next level, and it only serializes data that is used by functions which definitely need to be in the browser, which are the effects and the event handlers. And so that's another, all of this fine-grained, compiler-driven signal stuff all ties into our resumability and code splitting story as well. So I think it's quite unique in that aspect. And we've done, some benchmarks. We built a Hacker News demo of it and all that stuff, and it's all super promising. It's just there's so much, so many aspects of it. We have to have, essentially a super good serializer. We have to have a compiler that's smart enough to break all this stuff up, and obviously we're working on the language and the APIs and all that stuff. So it's there's so many pieces to it that it's obviously taken us quite a while to get it out, and we'd hoped that it would already be out at this point, and now we're looking at potentially June for a beta of it. But it's really quite crazy what it can accomplish in the parts where it does work now compared to pretty much anything else, including something like Quick. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's tricky until you can see the numbers, but hopefully I've done a little bit of hopefully that explanation makes sense. And if anyone did have specific questions on how any of it works, we'd be happy to answer that too.
I think a really powerful part of this dead cone elimination that Dylan touched on, but I think is worth reiterating, is that if you have a component that maybe has dynamic attributes and sometimes doesn't, then it only ships its JavaScript on the times when it has dynamic attributes. So maybe you have a set of comment components, and only the ones that were posted by you are editable. Now all the comments by everyone else will be shipped as vanilla raw HTML, and then yours will have JavaScript embedded with them only, and that's much more performant.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a whole bunch of work going into Marko 6 and this DX effort we've had in the new Marko meta framework and all that stuff. Yeah, I'm wondering what else is worth bringing up.
We should kind of talk about Marko 6 in general, because I know that's something that's been a long time in the making. So what's going to be for people who've never used Marko at all? Why is that something that they should care about?
Yeah, so the big thing with Marko 6 is obviously, or at least the hard part, is really these optimizations that we've been talking about, super aggressive code splitting. We're talking, our Hacker News example, it was 1 kilobyte for the entire final bundle, right, for the Hacker News comment thing. And it's in some ways that's still a huge amount more JavaScript than is actually needed if you just inlined it. So there's certainly room to improve, but compared to every other framework, as a baseline, they're 3, 4, 5 or more times higher, and that's the good ones, right? So for building these really small JavaScript footprint applications, that's where Marko is going to shine, all the way down obviously to 0 JavaScript, but really incremental JavaScript. And so one of the places that actually has been causing us to put a bunch of effort into Marko 6 is this whole micro front ends setup that we have at eBay. So actually, I mentioned the individual pages at eBay are in many cases developed by entirely different teams with entirely different dependencies and all that sort of stuff. But it's their responsibility to make sure that their app and the experience that they ship is as small and lightweight as possible. So obviously, it's useful for that level. and also useful, in general, anytime you have sort of a high content or a high amount of content versus interactivity on your site. So it's useful for that for sure. But the other thing is that the ABA experience it actually goes one step beyond that. There are actually, on many pages, embedded experiences. So like a recommended item experience might be brought in, or a like get help experience, like dialogue and all that stuff might be brought in. And those are also managed by independent teams. And so it's very micro front-endy in that way. But our micro front-end setup is not entirely client-based, like module federation or something like that. It's actually all driven from HTML. Basically the contract is, I'm going to include this experience. It's a lot like an iframe, sort of. You say, give me this partial HTML, and I'll inject it into the page, either as I'm server rendering or in the client, to make sure that the asset execution order makes sense and all that stuff, but you have full access to the document. So these embedded applications also impact the performance and need to be small. And so, being able to deliver one of these embedded experiences with, 20 kilobytes of JavaScript is pretty important if you're trying to not impact some of the biggest pages at eBay. So like from the micro front ends perspective, from this multi-page app perspective, and really from the perspective of just sending as little JavaScript as possible, and that includes the amount of serialized JavaScript, that's where Marko is really going to shine, at least in terms of like performance. And my view is, like, I wish everyone could experience the Marko Tags API and the like refactoring wins and the developer experience of that. I think that's like huge and important as well. But certainly, like, we're trying to meet this performance goal, and then hope that once you take the step to say, I need this kind of performance, you're delighted by the developer experience as well. So it's kind of a two-pronged thing, but the initial reaction people typically have to the Marko syntax is, this is not JSX, or this is not quite HTML. And so that learning curve, at least initially, doesn't, I think, draw people in. Although I've yet to hear of someone who's used it seriously and was like, no, this, I don't like that this makes refactoring easier. So I don't know if Michael or anyone else on the Marko team had something to add to that. Curious. Also, I'm curious, like, of people here, like, what frameworks everyone is using, because one of the things.
Only Angular devs here.
Only Angular devs. Okay. Well, from an Angular dev perspective, I don't know how much you're caring about the performance of things, or I mean, you also have your own.
That's probably more so React devs is our audience.
I see. Okay.
It's actually got a lot of solid people here, but I know we actually do have a handful of Angular devs here.
Right.
But
yeah,
I first came to Marko having kind of played around a little bit with all the frameworks, and I found it to be very unique and different, but I also agree that it really didn't have a super difficult learning curve. Like, I felt like I picked it up pretty quickly, and like all the syntax again intuitively made a lot of sense, and like the docs were pretty thorough. So yeah, I found that it's a very heady framework when you talk about how it works under the hood, but actually using it is not that overwhelming.
Right, and that's kind of our goal, like I said, with the language design and all that stuff, is to make it so that like the hard parts can be abstracted from you, and also just by its nature, like the design of it is, let's take HTML and JavaScript and make a declarative language that allows you to represent components that brings them together, right? So it's like, there's obviously a lot of our shorthands are inspired by JavaScript, and a lot of the declarative stuff is inspired by HTML. So if you're familiar with both of them, there's just a few things that you have to add, like, oh, I can use this JavaScript-like syntax as an attribute, or JavaScript variables can come after this character after the tag. And so there's like probably 6 or so different syntaxes that are unique to Marko that you need to learn. But then beyond that, it's just you have JavaScript embedded in some places and you have HTML embedded in some places. So the learning curve isn't actually too crazy from that front.
Cool. I'd actually kind of be curious to kind of take a sidestep and ask, like, we got 4 people from the team up here. How is the team kind of organized? Like, what are duties and responsibilities? Like, are some people focus more on outreach and more on engineering, or does everyone do a little bit of everything? Like, how does that work?
I can probably speak to that. So mostly, like, everyone here is focused on the engineering aspect of it, but as far as like who's doing sort of what kind of engineering, it's Michael and I have obviously been at ABA the longest and are working on the big things. Michael's primarily working on Marko 6, and I've been working on a lot of the tooling stuff like TypeScript support, and we all are obviously chiming in and working with each other on the various different things. And so pretty soon here, like since I've just wrapped up TypeScript support, we're all going to be trying to get Marko 6 across the finish line as quickly as we can, essentially. But so another thing is, like, besides Marko, we're a part of the Web Foundations team at eBay, which is basically responsible for a whole bunch of internal guidance and infrastructure stuff around like the web front end and guidance and all that sort of thing. So we have to, basically we're trying to figure out what is the best developer experience at eBay that we can achieve. Obviously, Marko is a big part of that, but there's other things that we look into too, which is why you'll see like different types of tooling come out in the Marko organization as well. Yeah, so we definitely don't have a full-time or anyone really working on developer like evangelizing or anything sort of like that. We just take it up ourselves. It's something that we want to look into eventually. We don't even have a designer. A lot of that stuff has been by Michael, and so it is something that we're hoping to get more support on. So yeah, we hope that we're going to be able to do more outreach and all that soon. But the reality is, like, right now we're just so focused on trying to get Marko 6 out, and then once it's out and we're happy with it, we're going to be sort of making the rounds and trying to make Marko a little less obscure. But at the same time, in some ways, it's fine if it's obscure because we at least have one giant customer that is eBay, and we're trying to meet their needs as well. But like, this technology is so cool that we just want everyone to be able to at least play with it as well. Is there anything you'd add, Michael?
I think that's mostly it. Yeah.
I had a question about routing. When you have the Marko system, which is like so compiler driven, similar to Svelte, how does that affect routing compared to, let's say, like a remix, like a file system routing, kind of like you have like React router kind of, and the remix is sort of like React router with some server side stuff. How would the routing system compare? I'm sort of like, don't really know a lot about it. I'm really interested to know more about how routing works and stuff.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and it's one of the things that I think people first come into Marko and they're like, at least up until recently, there isn't an official router. Like, how do you guys not have an official router? And that's extremely confusing to people. But the reason for it is that typically Marko applications are designed to be multi-page apps that are rendered on the server. So you bring in, Express, you bring in Fastfile, whatever server-side rendering technology you want to use, and Marko is the one that ensures like all the assets are hooked up properly. So the developer experience typically is you just like import a Marko template into whatever type of backend project, like Node server you have, and you just render it, and Marko figures out what assets need to get sent to the browser, figures out how to serialize the components, hooks it all up. Like, you don't have to think about any of that side of things. And so that meant, normally you would just use like Express's routing system or Fastfy's routing system or something like that, with the exception being the new tool we put out, and we did have a different tool before that as well, a few iterations of it, but we do have a tool now that's sort of similar to Remix's file system based routing, except that it does have some unique things as well. Ryan Turnquist was actually the one who was doing most of the work on that front. He could talk a little bit about it and maybe go into speak more to that.
Yeah. So we were, trying to make something that we can use both in eBay and for the greater like open source world. And so, part of that effort was this Marko run, which is basically our meta framework, if you want to call it that. And so, we're trying to like, reach parity, I guess, with a lot of other tools that, Remix, Solid Start, Next, that kind of stuff. So it seemed like file system based routing was like, something that people, people either love or hate, but it seems like it's winning out. So part of the this Marko run thing, another part of it was like kind of moving to Vite as our bundling system. And so yeah, we basically kind of like came up with our schema for how we represent our file system routes, and through this Vite plugin, that is like the majority of the Marko Run project. We're generating, we're providing routing solution for you, and it's kind of interesting because since we're like a multi-page application first framework, and we have a compiler and all this, and we're like performance oriented. What we're doing for routing is, looking at your pages and generating a compiled try, basically. So like all the routing is compiled into a bunch of if statements that like renders the correct page for you. So that's kind of like an interesting thing I haven't really seen elsewhere, and I think it's going to lead to like pretty good performance for Marko Run applications.
That's cool. I'll try not to take this too far off base here, off tangent, but similar to like as opposed to like you compared it to Express Specify. For a server-based system for routing, where you hit a route and it gives you the data and you go there with the link. We're comparing runtimes the other day. I was talking to Kelsey, and we were talking about WASM, how it replaced Docker, the runtime. And it's like, it is very similar to what you're saying. It's like, it's already compiled. It's just a binary file. It's already, all the possibilities are already there. It's not like you can come up with a runtime possibility. Like, oh, we have look at this new runtime possibility. Or nothing like that. It's not calling. It's already compiled. You hit one of the possibilities and it's going to spit back some kind of something return to you. So sounds very similar. Okay, so you compile all the possibilities, pre-compile all the possibilities, then you get one of the options based on.
Yeah, technically there's also like a sister project to Marko that was developed when Marko which is called Lasso. It's actually a runtime based JavaScript bundler, so it bundles things on the fly, and that was built because when Marko came out, Webpack had barely started, so we were looking at Browserify and like all that stuff, and basically didn't cut it. So a bundler had to be developed alongside this as well. But ignoring the bundler aspect of it, which is largely, at least the Marko parts of figuring out what modules to send to the browser, is all in the Marko compiler. The experience of authoring a Marko app is very similar to the experience of just using Express with one of the view engines they have, like EJS or Pug or something like that, right? Where you just import a view template and render it, and it gives you an HTML string back. The big difference is that you can actually add interactivity in a declarative way to those templates, and Marko just figures out what assets need to go to the browser to make that happen.
That's cool. You lost me a little bit, but I can do some more research. Maybe hit you up offline, or not offline per se, but like off of this line. I was curious about how does the progressive, not to put you on the spot here, you can, if you don't want to answer the question, it's fine, or if it's not answerable. But how does the so I'm sorry. I did too much preamble. I lost my
no problem.
How does progressive enhancement fit into the picture?
Yeah, progressive enhancement. I mean, it's actually a lot easier to do progressive enhancement when your starting point is HTML, right? Like we're sending HTML over the wire. You're authoring in HTML. You're not trying to build these, HTML replacement mechanisms and all that stuff. So generally, we lean on HTML and recommend using the primitives and progressively enhancing stuff where possible. And plus, since Marko, you opt into where the JavaScript is used. Since we opt, we got Ryan. Hey, Ryan.
It says speaker. Can you speak?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the technical answer. I've been trying to connect for like 20 minutes. Twitter didn't let me. I restarted. I just reinstalled Twitter from scratch. So here I am. So sorry, continue, Dylan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, essentially since the model in your mind is adding JavaScript to an existing, experience, it kind of lends itself well to progressive enhancement, like from zero JavaScript and above. And also we are thinking of accessibility patterns as we go, and how can you represent things in an accessible way. Like one of the things that I think is kind of funny is React didn't have a stable way to get an ID that server rendered for like ever, right? Like that was something that always had to be built into the meta framework, but Marko's always had a way to do that, because getting a stable ID to be able to be used with, ARIA controls and stuff like that was something that we hit right away. So it's like, we are thinking about things from an accessibility standpoint as well, like from the language, but also we're a part, or one of the members of our team is a part of the accessibility initiative at eBay as well. So it's definitely something we have on our minds, and accessibility and progressive enhancement often go together, not always, but so it's definitely something.
I'll also say, I mean, there's only so much that a framework can do for you on the progressive enhancement piece. Though I think Remix has done a really good job at the meta framework level, and some of those patterns we're kind of taking and pulling into Marko Run to some extent, and we're going to be doing more on that front. But I just wanted to call out that Dylan, before he joined eBay, was like a progressive enhancement fanatic. So like this is stuff that we are thinking about. But I don't know, Dylan, if you want to. I think it'd be cool if you just shared a little bit about what you were doing.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, like I said, sort of at the beginning of this, I was at a place where I was just hammering out tons and tons of websites and thinking about, what the good parts of the web are, and that led me down progressive enhancement and streaming and like a whole bunch of different things. But one of the big pushes for me at that time was I need to support old browsers. I need to support IE8, and I want to write modern JavaScript. Like that's why I have Node, right? And so there's always this like tension of how could I progressively enhance the experience. And so that kind of pushed me down the model and, all that stuff. But what I ended up doing was thinking, okay, the simplest way to make it so that an experience just works is to have it so that whatever HTML is rendered from the server, because I already knew I needed server-side rendering, can just work. Like the things that you send to the browser should ultimately be a series of links and forms. Like what experience can you not represent with links and forms? Yes, there are some, but a lot of those even can be progressively enhanced to fall back onto links and forms. And so that was the simplest way I found to basically do progressive enhancement. And so I ended up building a router that is very similar to the current version of Koa. If you've never heard of Koa, it's kind of like Express, except a little bit more modern and promise-based and all that stuff. So I built this framework that was like Koa, except you could run it in the browser. And it all used the exact same APIs. So, and it was only like 30 KB, which is actually quite expensive, or quite a lot. But there's like a lot of polyfills you had to send for things like promises and like all that sort of stuff. But anyway, so you had this essentially mini node server that you could send to the browser, and it would intercept link clicks and form submissions. And so what you could do is essentially server render an application, and then once the browser like picked up, it would intercept all of these link clicks and form submissions and pipe them through the client-side router, which is essentially the same model that Remix has today. And actually, like all the similar things you could think of, like loaders and pattern actions and like all these sort of things that you see in Remix, also exist in that framework that was built at the exact same time, or just a little bit before React Router was made. So that's kind of my foray into progressive enhancement. And then that project is ultimately what led me to Marko when I was building integrations for different frameworks.
I don't want to
Awesome.
hog
Yeah,
your time
that-
if somebody else will talk. Sorry.
Yeah, I just pinned your FSJam interview where we dove into a lot of this stuff. It was actually the very first question I asked you was about progressive enhancement and how it related to partial hydration and all that kind of stuff. So I would point people to that interview. It's actually one of my favorite interviews I've ever done on that show. So really, really proud of that one. Now that we've got Ryan up here, actually, I'd be curious for you to speak just a little bit about your history working on Marko and why you have referred to it as the most underrated JavaScript framework.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of crazy to me because I like to look at lots of solutions. The whole way I approached building Solid was looking at lots of solutions in the space. So Marko was not on my radar at all. I was just hooks had recently come out, and I was like very hyped on the fact that people were switching back to primitives. So I was, just going along that thread, writing articles about signals and reactivity. When Michael and Dylan actually were like, hey, we're working on something that we think signals could help with. That's how I got pulled in. We were thinking that Marko 6 would be based on something like signals, and it kind of is, but it's interesting. Get to that in a second. But what I did find though was, they've been kind of like suggesting, like there's different things that Marko needed to be aware of early, like those IDs and like stable IDs and like a few other things. Marko has had like almost all the hype features of the last 2 years. Marko's had some version of for about 8 years. Just because now everyone is like rediscovering the server. Marko, technology changes over time and, different availability. But Marko, like from the start, was just like there. So like is like the kind of questions we're asking right now, Patrick Steele was asking back in 2013 or 12 or whatever he started working on this. So like I was honestly flabbergasted. Even though I've been working the web for, God, it was like 20 some odd years now. And I was aware of some older techniques. I didn't realize that JavaScript frameworks operated like this. It was like finding this treasure trove. It's so funny because I had some conversations with other people afterwards, like even like Rich Harrison Svelte and stuff, and it was like, hey, he asked me, why aren't people talking about Marko? And it was an interesting question to kind of think about. But beyond that, it was just so obvious what the value here is, both to use and for others to learn from. So like, yeah, I was very excited, especially at that point where I was at. This was an opportunity to come actually work on a JavaScript framework full-time, work on open source full-time. And I basically jumped at the opportunity, picking up my life, my family, everything, moving down to San Jose right at the beginning of COVID. So yeah, Marko has a lot in it to be excited about, and the work that done since just builds upon that foundation, right? Like, because here's the thing, like I entered the team, first couple months in. Sorry if I'm like just catching up here for the whole rest of the podcast. Can I get my perspective on here? And Michael and Dylan were the main guys present on that. There's also the other teams around the components and stuff, and these guys had already been thinking about the specific problem, like evidently for several years. Like Marko 6 might have not really gone to full swing until about 2020 in terms of developing for it or like putting the plans, but you could tell the roots of this go back to like 2017 time period. And basically it's the challenge of having two developers supporting all of eBay is a lot of work. It's actually migrating the hundreds and hundreds of apps over to, I guess, what was it, Marko 4 at the time?
Yeah.
So yeah, like there's been so much thinking and like design consideration that it's gone into almost every piece here that, yeah, I mean, this is why every time it comes up, I'm just like, I kind of still in awe that when I talk to people and they're like, they're like, you know, you make jokes, you know, like the thing is like, you never say like what the best JavaScript framework is. Everyone, you know, has their opinions. I always like give Marko a free pass on that just because of how far in this particular area the thinking has gone beyond where most other frameworks are like just kind of just dipping into. To be fair, the big like this has been a known thing for a while. The work that React's doing on RCs started really back in 2016, 17 period. The work for Quick started in 2019 time period. So like there's a long tail to get to where we are today. But I just like I want to say like this is where I go to, and this think tank when I really want to vet an idea of like where things should be heading.
Yeah, this is why I think it's so important for web developers to study history and to understand the historical context of these different frameworks. Because, like I came in, like 2020 is when I really got serious about development. So all of that stuff, predates me. But I found that just by digging into like blog posts, like there's like all these blog posts from eBay going back to even the creation of Marko, and they reference blog posts from like 2006 that they were taking influence from. So you can learn so much just by digging into the history of these projects and like take a day off of whatever like the Twitter hype of the day is. Like instead of arguing about Tailwind for 6 hours, maybe learn something useful, So I really think that more people should study this framework. I think they would learn a lot doing so. We have probably about another 15 minutes left, and we can go on if we need to, but I think we could probably start closing it out fairly soon. Do people have other things they want to talk about that are relevant to Marko, or do other people in the audience have questions? And feel free, Dylan, Michael, Ryan, Luke, just hop in with anything on your minds.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely will echo the looking at what has been done in the past, because there's so many things that if you just take a different look at it today, or think about what the implications of it were in today's context, that you can do something that's like a huge improvement to the current status quo. And Marko is a lot of that, right? Like you mentioned, the pointing to articles from 2006 where people are looking into streaming and all that stuff. And actually, even earlier than that, people were using streaming. So sometimes these old technologies with just a little bit of polish and a little bit of a modern tinge on them can be hugely powerful.
I feel like for the last several decades, there's been like an article that gets like a lot of attention that's posted like every few years, like every 5, 6, 7 years. It's like the lost art of streaming. And it's like
yeah. Every time we see stuff like that,
funny
we're like,
how that keeps coming around. It might stick this time. It seems like it might stick this time.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Ryan go.
Yeah, I was going to say the 2005 article that I think AJ was referring to was actually called "The Lost Art of Progressive Rendering or Streaming." Like that was actually the name of the 2005 article.
Post all these. I've got them right here.
Yeah,
go ahead. I'm just gonna pin these up.
The other thing, and like I said, I feel like it's underappreciated. I hope that eventually, especially once we get Marko 6 out, that people will try just the Marko language. Like, ignore the performance aspects of it. Think about and look at the DX and like, does it make it easier to author components? And I think once you get into it, the answer will be yes. I would still like to, and I did this or showed this off on Ryan's stream at one point, have a way for you to use Marko's language that compiles to JSX so that you can like take advantage of some of the language features. I think that would be cool to be able to be used in other frameworks even because I mean JSX, and this is a whole nother tangent, but like there is a lot to be desired in this language that in my view essentially just bootstrapped a bad version of XML onto JavaScript of the time, which didn't even yet have like template literals and stuff. So I have a low view of JSX, and I think if people were to try the Marko language, that they would come to like a lot of its features. I'd be actually curious, Luke or Ryan's take on that particular side of things, having most recently come from, React.
Yeah, I think what separates Marko language, or I think we're calling it HTML JS internally, from JSX most, is that in JSX, the line between JavaScript and HTML is pretty clear. You can tell where you're writing JavaScript and where you're writing HTML. And for Marko, I wouldn't say it's a blurrier line, but it's more like you're kind of writing both at the same time, and you always know which one you're writing in, but you don't have to worry about switching from HTML mode to JavaScript mode. It kind of just happens naturally where you know you want to switch already. And that makes my authoring experience a lot easier because you're only keeping track of one language instead of two.
Yeah, one other thing that I point out is we're also trying to look at everything from the language perspective in terms of like, how are people actually going to use this? How are people actually writing stuff? What is the pattern? What is the goal that they're actually trying to achieve? And so that's where we get like the optimization side of things, but also these like easier refactors. One thing that I think is like probably my favorite feature of Marko 6 is this concept we have of controllable components, which we don't have time to go into right now. But all that is to say, like, there is a lot there just in the language. Don't feel like, performance is the only thing we're competing on. We're not necessarily like, there's definitely two paths that we're trying to fight on here, which is, obviously the performance, because that's important for eBay's needs. But Marko, from its inception, the goal was, how can we have a good DX and a modern development experience? And so that's definitely one of our pillars as well.
The language piece is actually very interesting, because a part of, I feel, is that people don't want to learn like a new syntax or something, or they don't want to like get away from the standards. The problem is that the standards as we know them today aren't holding up, and won't hold up. This is like, people, there's some fear and concern around compilation and about different syntaxes and whatnot. But the problem is that JavaScript has failed us at being a good language for representing UIs. It has. We wouldn't have hooks and hook rules. We wouldn't have the don't lose reactivity, conditions, all this, if we weren't basically trying to like invent this sort of pseudo language on top of JavaScript. And some do better than others, but like every place that we do it, we hit new challenges and problems. So because like Svelte's kind of brought into our kind of common thinking that the language should look like JavaScript, but Svelte also doesn't have composition patterns as part of the compilation. If you want to use what are they called, their directives or actions, or I can't remember what they called, the use : thing, well, you're writing that in plain JavaScript. You're not using Svelte lang. If you want to write a composable hook, you're using stores, again, JavaScript, not in Svelte lang. And the thing is, the problem here is that, from an analysis standpoint, JavaScript is hard. It's like React's going to come up with this forget compiler, but it's also going to have interesting behaviors and rules that don't actually reflect JavaScript. You might write something that looks like JavaScript, but it isn't actually JavaScript. And we're trying so hard to tie our hands to kind of keep in this familiarity zone that, like, there's a whole bunch of issues and trade-offs that come down to that, being that the language itself, the syntax, the semantics are not the best for designing UIs. So I think what Marko's doing is interesting in that it's saying, okay, well, screw that. I'm going to make a language specially to this purpose. So where I can tell that something is a stateful reactive variable, for example, and that I can mark that, and that the system knows this, and that the language can basically do its job without having a mind reader of an AI trying to figure out how to compile your stuff. Like this is the problem we face today with frameworks. It is a language problem. So a language solution seems like it might be the way.
Yeah, I would just add, like, a lot of other solutions will basically abuse, and I'm kind of picking on Svelte a little bit, abuse different JavaScript language features to mean something else. But if you're going to say that a feature means something else, well, what does that mean for other tooling that's going to be working with that particular feature? Does that abstraction leak in terms of, auto completions, in terms of, what variables it says are available, or what narrowing TypeScript has done, like all these sort of things. The abstraction can leak depending on how you're abusing or using JavaScript's syntax. Or on the other side, like on the solid side, like if you're using regular JavaScript syntax, but the semantics of how your components run is more restrictive than what the JavaScript syntax can represent. And so something like TypeScript on top of it won't necessarily be able to provide you the ideal editing experience, unless TypeScript goes and adds specific support for specific frameworks, which I guess they're all for doing. But
if your framework's name starts with an R and ends with a T.
Yeah. If you're that framework, then you don't have to worry. But otherwise, if your framework is doing something where, if the IntelliSense could know just this one little fact about your framework, all of a sudden the types get better and all that sort of stuff, that's really hard to do if the thing that you're augmenting or working with is JavaScript as an API for describing your UIs. But since we're building it a level on top of that, we get to decide what the meaning of a variable that's provided to you from Marko is, and what the meaning of the body content is, how things get narrowed. We have control over that, which is a lot of work, to be clear.
It's a lot of work, and I do want to shout out that Dylan has done a great job over the past several months getting our tooling into a good place, because there's a lot that has to happen in designing your own language, and I totally understand why most other frameworks have not gone down this route, because it is a lot of work. But I think Dylan's done a really good job, and the rest of the team. I mean, it has been a collaboration, but Dylan's definitely been leading it, and getting the tooling into a really, really good place where it feels like you're not giving up, anything by using this, what is essentially a custom DSL.
Yeah, and I'll just add, even though it is a lot of work, sometimes some DX wins, some new features, some APIs, they do require a lot of work, but that doesn't mean that they're not useful, or once you have them, it's wow, how did I do anything without this? We lived in a world without TypeScript forever, and I'm not saying TypeScript is perfect, but yeah, but you do live in a world with VS Code giving you at least JavaScript completions. So back when I first started writing JavaScript, there was none of that, right? So it was very much remember the application in my mind. Anyways, all that is to say is the tooling that went into even just those auto completions and stuff like that is immense, but it's now we can't live without it, right? And so even though we're putting in a lot of work into this language, it might be well, why not just use JSX? So it's well, there's some things that JSX can't represent, and we could make better tooling if we just throw out the underlying issue, which is this sort of limited DSL that's built into JavaScript. And so, it's a lot of work, but I think it's also fairly fruitful. Anyways.
Sort of making a long-term bet here. That's the way that I look at this, because the funny thing is, if you believe this is an inevitable conclusion, all the steps that we're doing right now are sort of intermediate steps along that path, so to speak. So the final result might end up being different if people go different paths to it. But it's interesting to me, at least, that that's we could talk about Marko 6 taking a while. It taking a while has so little impact on how current, how modern, how powerful it's going to feel when it comes out, because at the point that this comes out, from at least a raw technology standpoint, it's other stuff will have not caught up. So even if it takes longer, which don't, but I'm just saying if it did, that part isn't a concern because it's kind of been the sort of long shot leap stepping a couple steps along the way. Because, I mean, it depends. If you think that is the inevitable future, then this is probably a really smart bet to make.
Yeah, and at least for the types of things that we're building at eBay and the experiences we see and the way that the application as a whole is architectured, it seems like the safest bet for us is to account for the fact that we're going to want to send ridiculous amounts of JavaScript to the browser and make tooling that makes it hard to do that or impossible to do that, and maintains the DX. So at least that's our bet on the performance side. And obviously there's a whole bunch of different facets of it, like the bundling, the rendering, and serialization, and all that stuff. But yeah, so it's definitely sort of where we see the future going, and a lot of tooling is looking into that right now. I was like super happy when Astro was released and looked at partial hydration. Like pretty much no other framework picked that up or took it seriously. Obviously React Server components are like semi-similar,
Linkity
but it's
did.
like,
That's another one.
Yeah,
Although that
I mean,
one died
there's
on the
definitely
vine.
some, but it's like it was few and far between for what is a very conceptually simple optimization that I think makes sense for the vast majority of sites that people are building, right? Like if you're doing server rendering at all and you're fine with your page, having a multi-page app, why are you sending your entire application to the browser? You've already said the server can do some amount of the work and the browser just needs to do these like, little updates here and there sort of thing. So it's like such a low-hanging fruit optimization that we were only seeing somewhat recently. And then obviously, we're taking that like core idea to the extreme and saying, well, let's not do like individual top level islands or whatever. Let's actually figure out what the real JavaScript that needs to be sent to the browser, and only that JavaScript, so that we can get closer to the actual like best performance you can have in the web, which is an inline script that does exactly what you want it to do, right? So that's what philosophically we're trying to go towards. Not so that Marko 6 gets there, but it's definitely way closer to that than anything else that exists right now.
Yep, chasing that dream. Well, I hope to see Marko 6 sometime this decade. I'm holding out hope still.
This decade for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. It was a super great conversation. I really encourage everyone in the audience to follow these guys. They are super cool devs, and I have pinned a whole bunch of tweets up top. One for Marko Run is up there right now. I think that's kind of the newest, hottest thing you've got that people can try out. And then where should people go if they want to get involved with the community?
Definitely check out our Discord or go to the markojs.com website, which has a link to our Discord. That's where all of us hang out in the various
Discord.gg/Marko.
Oh yeah, there you go. Michael's got it.
Awesome. Well, any other parting words for our guests or our audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the big thing for me is look at the web as a like what's unique about the web compared to every other platform. And to know that, you have to look at its history. You have to think about things like progressive enhancement. Like try not to get a surface level one frame perspective on everything. I think if you expand your horizons, you'll become a better dev and deliver more delightful user experiences.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank everyone for joining us, and we'll be doing this same time next week, Wednesday, 12 p.m. Pacific. And yeah, as we get closer to React Miami, we're going to be talking with some people who are speaking there. We've got one lined up with Henri in a couple weeks, so that'll be fun. But yeah, love to see you all next week, and that'll close out for us.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for being here. Bye, everyone.